The morning of April 3, 1865, in Richmond, Virginia, dawned through a haze of smoke, the lingering scent of desperation and destruction. From behind lace-draped windows, the city's women, many already draped in mourning, watched, their hearts a drumbeat of dread. They awaited the conquerors. But as the first blue columns appeared on Broad Street, their rhythmic boots echoing on the cobblestones, an impossible sight began to emerge. Not just Union soldiers, but uniformed black men, their bayonets glinting in the pale morning light, marching with the discipline of a victorious army. It was a vision that shattered more than just their hopes. It shattered their entire world. This was not merely a military defeat. It was a psychological earthquake, a deliberate declaration of power that forced a city and a nation to confront the deepest fault lines of its identity. How do you reconcile a lifetime of ingrained belief with the undeniable proof that everything you thought was true was a lie? Before we unravel this incredible story, tell us in the comments, where are you watching us from today? On Hidden Files, we explore the moments that redefine history. And this one, carved into memory, changed everything. The night of April 2, 1865, descended upon Richmond, Virginia, not with the usual tranquility of a southern spring evening, but with the suffocating weight of its own demise. A thick, acrid pall of smoke hung low over the city, the unmistakable scent of burning paper, ignited cotton, and scorched timber stinging the eyes and choking the breath. This was the deliberate, desperate immolation of a capital, a final destructive act by a retreating Confederacy intent on denying its enemy any plunder. Along the James River, colossal warehouses, once overflowing with tobacco, flour, and vital military provisions, roared with an uncontrolled fury. The orange glow of the flames painted the low-lying clouds in an infernal tableau, casting long, dancing shadows across the emptying streets and reflecting off the somber waters below. Explosions, muffled by the burning structures, punctuated the night, each blast signaling the further dismantling of the Confederate war machine. Within the opulent, yet increasingly beleaguered, Confederate White House, a sense of hurried urgency had replaced the customary decorum. President Jefferson Davis, his lean face etched with the strain of 4 years of war and the immediate agony of defeat, supervised his hurried evacuation. Documents deemed critical, along with a minimal selection of personal effects, were loaded onto a waiting carriage. His staff moved with a practiced, somber efficiency, the quiet rustle of papers and the low murmur of instructions, the only sounds in the grand halls that had once buzzed with the frantic energy of a nascent nation. Davis's departure was not a retreat. It was an abrupt, almost frantic flight from a city teetering on the brink of occupation. He maintained a semblance of grim determination, but the weight of his monumental failure was palpable in his stoic silence. His last official acts had been to order the city's destruction to prevent its resources from falling into Union hands, a final devastating paradox for the man who had pledged to defend it. Hours prior, the stark reality of the situation had been conveyed to Davis through a terse dispatch from General Robert E. Lee. The lines defending Petersburg, the crucial rail hub safeguarding Richmond, had broken. Lee, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, had informed the president that further defense of the capital was impossible. The formidable Army of Northern Virginia, exhausted, depleted, and outmaneuvered, was already in motion, embarking on its final desperate withdrawal to the west. This retreat was not merely a tactical maneuver. It was the unraveling of the Confederacy's primary fighting force, a forced march that would ultimately culminate in Appomattox. In the dimly lit, smoke-filled offices of Confederate Military Command, maps lay unfurled, their strategic markings now rendered obsolete. Officers, their uniforms stained with the grit of failed campaigns, huddled in hushed, defeated conversations. The air was thick with a heavy resignation, a profound weariness replacing the earlier fervor. Orders for the final stages of the evacuation and destruction were issued in muted tones, devoid of their usual military crispness. There was no defiance left, only the cold, hard logic of survival, and the bitter knowledge that their cause, their grand experiment in secession, was reaching its inevitable, catastrophic end. The silence that followed the last barked commands was more eloquent than any speech, signaling the final acceptance of their undoing. Throughout the burning city, behind the elegant red brick facades of Richmond's Georgian mansions, a different kind of vigil was underway. Women, many of them draped in the heavy black fabrics that had become the unofficial uniform of the war-torn South, observed the unfolding catastrophe from behind lace-draped windows and half-open shutters. This was a population hardened by loss, accustomed to scarcity, yet wholly unprepared for the spectacle of their capital in flames, awaiting the arrival of the conquering army. Emma Mordecai, a member of a prominent Jewish family in Richmond, stood by her window, her gaze fixed on the inferno consuming the city's waterfront. The flickering light from the distant blazes danced in her eyes, reflecting the surreal horror outside. Her meticulously kept journals, filled with the daily anxieties of a city under siege, would soon bear witness to a new, unimaginable chapter. There was a palpable terror in the air, fear of reprisal, fear of the unknown, fear of an irrevocably altered social order. Yet, intertwined with this dread, was a profound, almost compulsive curiosity. She, like many others, found it impossible to turn away, compelled to witness the very moment their world fractured. In another mansion, Judith McGuire, a prolific diarist known for her detailed observations, sat poised, perhaps with pen in hand, documenting the sounds and sights of the city's final hours. For weeks, her entries had recounted the mounting dread, the scarcity of food, and the relentless bombardments. Now, the fear in her entries would give way to an almost academic recording of the collapse. She had watched sons, brothers, and husbands march off to war, many never to return. Now, she prepared to watch the triumphant entry of the very forces they had so fiercely resisted. Her mental preparation for the conquerors involved not just bracing for their arrival, but attempting to grasp the magnitude of the social upheaval it represented. The mourning attire worn by so many women was not just for fallen soldiers, it was for a lost way of life. Miles beyond the burning city's perimeter, the Union forces stood in organized, disciplined readiness. General Godfrey Weitzel, a highly capable military engineer at the age of 30, commanded the forces designated for Richmond's occupation. His encampment, a stark contrast to the chaos within the Confederate capital, hummed with a quiet, purposeful efficiency. Intelligence reports confirmed by the visible conflagrations indicated the complete abandonment of Richmond by the Confederate government and military. The city, a powerful symbol of the rebellion, lay open for the taking. As dawn approached on April 3rd, a strategic decision of immense historical weight was finalized within Weitzel's command tent. This was not merely a tactical deployment, but a deliberate psychological maneuver. Weitzel understood that the occupation of Richmond transcended military conquest. It was a moment of profound symbolic significance for the entire nation. He resolved that among the first Union troops to march into the heart of the defeated Confederacy would be regiments of the United States Colored Troops, USCT. This decision was not born of chance or convenience. It was a calculated statement, a direct, powerful message intended for the devastated South and for the wider world. The USCT, comprised of men who had been legally considered property in the very territories they were now poised to occupy, represented the most radical transformation of the war's purpose. Units such as the 5th Massachusetts Colored Cavalry Regiment and elements of the 25th Corps, composed entirely of these African American soldiers, were designated to spearhead the entry. Their discipline, their uniforms, their weapons, every aspect of their presence was intended to directly confront the foundational ideologies of white supremacy and chattel slavery upon which the Confederacy had been built. The stage was thus meticulously set. The burning embers of Confederate Richmond would be extinguished not just by Union forces, but by the very men whose humanity had been denied for generations within its walls. As the first pale light of dawn began to break through the smoke-laden sky, signaling the end of an agonizing night and the beginning of a new, uncertain day, the designated regiments stood ready. Their imminent march into the former capital of the Confederacy was poised to deliver a psychological shockwave, a visual testament to the seismic shift in the nation's power dynamics and the redefined meaning of freedom, permanently etched into the annals of American history. The dawn of April 3, 1865, did not bring relief to Richmond, Virginia, but rather solidified the grim reality of its fall. The sky remained a muted canvas, still streaked with the ochre and gray of lingering smoke, a testament to the night's fiery destruction. The air was thick, heavy with the acrid scent of charred timber, burnt cotton and sodden ash, a pervasive odor that permeated clothing, skin, and memory. Along the James River, where Confederate forces had desperately tried to deny the Union Army vital supplies, structures stood as skeletal ruins, their brick facades blackened, their interior timbers reduced to cinders. Rubble and debris, the detritus of a collapsing regime, choked the thoroughfares nearest the waterfront. A profound, almost unnatural quiet had descended upon the city, broken only by the mournful creak of cooling metal, the distant crackle of dying embers, and the occasional unsettling silence where once there had been the constant hum of industry. Yet, this silence was not absolute. From the eastern approaches of Broad Street, a new sound began to emerge, faint at first, then growing with an inexorable certainty. It was the rhythmic thud of hundreds, then thousands, of boots striking cobblestone in unison. A deep resonant beat that carried through the damp, smoke-laden air, echoing between the grand Georgian mansions and the storefronts of the city's primary artery. This was the sound of the conquerors, a methodical, relentless drumbeat announcing their arrival, a sonic prelude to the visual spectacle that would shatter the remaining illusions of the Confederacy. Residents who had endured a night of terror now pressed closer to their windows, their faces etched with a complex blend of dread, apprehension, and an almost compulsive desire to witness the inevitable. The tension in the atmosphere was a tangible thing, a taut wire stretched to its breaking point. As the first columns of Union soldiers turned onto Broad Street, their uniforms a crisp blue against the somber backdrop of the dawn, a collective, silent intake of breath rippled through the city's hidden observers. Mounted officers, their postures ramrod straight, led the vanguard, their horses' hooves clattering sharply on the wet stones. Flags, unfurled and snapping in the gentle breeze, bore the familiar stars and stripes, a potent symbol of reunification that, in Richmond, was received with the chill of subjugation. The initial sight, though intimidating, offered a fleeting, almost perverse sense of a known enemy. It was the expected image of a conquering army, white officers, white soldiers, the conventional forces of the federal government. But this fleeting, grim familiarity was abruptly and irrevocably shattered as the full scope of the advancing force became horrifically, undeniably clear. Behind the initial ranks of conventional Union troops, an unthinkable vision materialized. Row after disciplined row, uniformed black men marched with an unwavering resolve. They wore the standard-issue blue wool coats, their brass buttons gleaming dully in the weak morning light. Each soldier carried a Springfield musket, its long, oiled barrel held at a precise angle, topped with a polished bayonet that caught the diffuse sunlight like a cold, sharp star. Their dark faces, framed by their military kepis, were set with a profound, almost defiant purpose, their eyes fixed straight ahead. This was no auxiliary force, no labor detail assigned to clean up the city's debris. These were soldiers, in every visible and undeniable respect, of the United States Colored Troops, USCT, marching as the spearhead of the Union victory, entering the very heart of the former Confederacy. For the white residents of Richmond, a society fundamentally structured upon the premise of racial hierarchy and the systematic subjugation of black individuals, this was not merely a military occupation. It was an ideological invasion, a sight that defied every ingrained belief. Emma Mordecai, from her vantage point behind the heavy lace curtains of her family mansion, felt a visceral shock course through her. Her fear, a constant companion throughout the protracted siege, was abruptly transmuted into a profound cognitive dissonance. Her gaze, which she later recorded as impossible to turn away, became transfixed, a blend of horror and a terrible, almost hypnotic fascination. Every detail of the soldiers below, their crisp, well-maintained uniforms, the precise alignment of their ranks, the confident, synchronized stride, the practiced ease with which they carried their formidable weapons, stood in direct, undeniable contradiction to every tenet of the world she had inherited. She had been raised within a societal framework that categorically defined black individuals as chattel, as property, inherently inferior, intellectually incapable, and morally subservient. The very notion of these men wielding muskets with such disciplined authority, marching as conquerors on Broad Street, the grand artery of the slave-holding South, was not merely an abstract thought. It was a physical assault on the core of her understanding of existence. Her mind, trained to categorize and rationalize, struggled violently to reconcile the tangible reality before her with the deeply ingrained self-serving ideology of white supremacy. It was a spectacle that simultaneously repelled and mesmerized, forcing her to confront, in that raw, immediate moment, the absolute and undeniable collapse of the social order that had defined her entire life. The image etched itself onto her memory, a vivid, horrifying tableau of a world being irrevocably torn asunder. In a neighboring mansion, Judith McGuire, whose meticulously detailed wartime diary offered a candid chronicle of Richmond's experience, similarly absorbed the shocking scene. Her entry would later note the dignity that forced us to recognize them as soldiers, not as the servants we had known. This was not a casual observation, nor a willing concession. It was a profound, almost reluctant acknowledgement, wrested from her by the irrefutable evidence before her eyes. The bearing of these black soldiers, their martial discipline, their evident self-possession, and the palpable sense of purpose in their rhythmic march transcended the dehumanizing caricatures and stereotypes that had been the bedrock of Southern society. To acknowledge their dignity as soldiers was, for McGuire and her peers, to dismantle, in that very moment, the entire elaborate edifice of racial hierarchy that had shaped their lives and the lives of generations before them. The concept of a black man as a servant was not merely a social role, it was an ingrained, unquestioned natural order in her worldview. But these men were not subservient. They were powerful. They were not property. They were armed agents of a victorious government, their blue uniforms a declaration of status and authority. Their presence on Broad Street was a living, breathing refutation of the fundamental Southern premise that black individuals lacked the capacity for self-governance, discipline, or martial prowess. The sight compelled a radical reevaluation, a raw, unbidden recognition that shattered the mental constructs she had held sacred. For these white women of Richmond, and indeed for the collective white psyche of the city, the arrival of the United States colored troops was far more than a military occupation. It was a profound psychological earthquake. It was the materialization of their deepest racial and social anxieties, a living nightmare that directly challenged and began to dismantle their most deeply held beliefs in black inferiority and white supremacy. The rhythmic thud of the USCT's boots on the cobblestones of Broad Street was not merely the sound of an army marching. It was the relentless, unforgiving rhythm of a world being irrevocably torn asunder, its old lies consumed by the very truth they had sought so desperately to suppress. The columns continued to advance, each step a physical and symbolic declaration, marking the end of one historical chapter and the fraught, contentious beginning of another. The shock on the faces of Richmond's white residents as the United States colored troops marched down Broad Street was profound, a visible manifestation of their world irrevocably fractured. Yet, this improbable spectacle, this vision of armed black men conquering the Confederate capital, was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of a revolutionary transformation forged in the crucible of the Civil War itself, a historical shift rooted in the very ideological foundations that Richmond had so fiercely sought to defend. To understand the impact of April 3, 1865, one must first revisit the origins of the conflict and the radical evolution of the Union's war aims. Only 4 years prior, in 1861, Virginia's secession from the Union had propelled Richmond into its pivotal role as the capital of the Confederate States of America. This designation was far from arbitrary. Richmond, a city of significant industrial capacity, home to the Tredegar Iron Works which forged cannons for the Southern cause, was also a powerful symbol of the Confederacy's foundational principle, the preservation and expansion of chattel slavery. For the white South, Richmond represented the unwavering determination to maintain an economic and social system built upon the forced labor and dehumanization of millions of African Americans. The city's identity was intertwined with the institution of slavery, making its eventual fall to regiments primarily composed of formerly enslaved men a particularly potent and ironic twist of fate. At the outset of the war, the Union's stance on black military service was markedly different. While some free black men in the North offered their services, they were largely rejected. Prevailing racial prejudices, even within abolitionist circles, fueled skepticism about the fighting capabilities of black soldiers. Furthermore, President Abraham Lincoln's initial war aim was the preservation of the Union, not the abolition of slavery. To actively recruit black soldiers would have been a controversial political move, potentially alienating border states that remained loyal to the Union but still practiced slavery. For nearly 2 years, the Union Army remained by design an overwhelmingly white fighting force. However, the brutal realities of the conflict gradually eroded these initial hesitations. As the war dragged on, costing hundreds of thousands of lives and demanding ever-increasing manpower, the strategic landscape began to shift. The Union's failure to achieve a swift victory, coupled with growing abolitionist pressure and the practical necessity of leveraging every available resource, forced a re-evaluation of black enlistment. Enslaved people fleeing to Union lines, often called contraband of war, demonstrated a fierce desire for freedom and a willingness to fight for it. Their courage and resilience, witnessed firsthand by Union officers, began to challenge ingrained prejudices. The pivotal moment arrived on January 1, 1863, with Abraham Lincoln's issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. This landmark executive order declared all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory to be, thenceforward and forever free. Beyond its monumental humanitarian implications, the proclamation served a crucial strategic purpose. It redefined the war, transforming it from a conflict solely to preserve the Union into a moral crusade against slavery. Crucially, it also opened the pathway for the formal enlistment of black men into the federal armed forces. The proclamation explicitly stated that freed slaves will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. This was a revolutionary directive, officially sanctioning what had previously been unthinkable. What began as a controversial experiment quickly evolved into a substantial and indispensable military force. Initially, many white Union officers harbored deep-seated doubts about the combat effectiveness of black soldiers. They questioned their courage under fire, their discipline, and their ability to withstand the rigors of battle. Yet these prejudices were systematically dismantled on countless battlefields. Black regiments, often facing harsher conditions, discriminatory pay, until 1864, and the constant threat of brutal treatment if captured by Confederates, fought with extraordinary valor. Their bravery was not anecdotal, it was documented in over 450 engagements, including 39 major battles. At Port Hudson, Louisiana, in May 1863, the 1st and 3rd Regiments of the Native Guards, Louisiana USCT, launched repeated costly assaults against entrenched Confederate positions, proving their mettle against overwhelming odds. The following July, at Fort Wagner, South Carolina, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, an early and highly visible black regiment, spearheaded a desperate charge, suffering immense casualties but demonstrating a courage that captured national attention and silenced many critics. These sacrifices solidified their reputation, proving beyond doubt that black soldiers were not only capable, but indispensable to the Union war effort. By 1865, the United States Colored Troops, USCT, had swelled to an impressive force of approximately 180,000 soldiers, constituting roughly 10% of the entire Union Army. These men hailed from diverse backgrounds. Some were free black men from the North, but a significant majority were formerly enslaved, having escaped plantations or been liberated by advancing Union armies. They served across all theaters of the war, their presence on the front lines a powerful testament to their commitment to freedom and their right to citizenship. Their participation profoundly reshaped the social and political landscape of the nation, demanding a reckoning with the very principles of liberty and equality. It was this very history, this journey from bondage to armed service, that was embodied in the soldiers marching through Richmond that fateful April morning. Regiments like the 5th Massachusetts Colored Cavalry, a unit known for its tenacity and skill, and elements of the 25th Corps, which was comprised entirely of USCT, represented the pinnacle of this transformation. Many of these soldiers carried personal histories deeply intertwined with the very streets they now traversed as conquerors. Some might have been born into slavery within Virginia, or even within sight of Richmond itself, a city that was one of the largest slave trading markets in the South. They marched past the very auction blocks where human beings had been sold, past the grim walls of Lumpkin's jail where runaways were held, and through districts where the wealth generated by their forced labor had built the grand mansions now watching in silent horror. Their blue wool uniforms, their leather kepis, their crisscrossed white belts, and their gleaming bayonets were not just military accoutrements, they were potent symbols. Each piece of their attire, each rhythmic step, each glint of steel, represented a radical metamorphosis of status, from property to person, from enslaved to citizen soldier. They were not merely occupying a city, they were reclaiming a history, fundamentally altering the narrative of their own lives and the destiny of a nation. The reverberations of their boots on the cobblestones were not just the sound of victory, but the profound echo of a new, if contentious era of freedom and redefined citizenship. The profound division that cleaved Richmond, Virginia, on April 3, 1865, was not merely a physical chasm separating the occupied from the occupiers. It was a vast, emotional abyss, creating two irreconcilable realities within the same city. As the disciplined columns of the United States Colored Troops, USCT, continued their methodical march down Broad Street, the very air seemed to vibrate with a tension that elicited diametrically opposed responses from the city's inhabitants. The rhythmic, purposeful beat of their boots against the cobblestones became the soundtrack to a city simultaneously shattering and being reborn. For Richmond's black population, estimated at over 10,000 individuals, the sight of the USCT was not a defeat, but a monumental deliverance. For generations, Richmond had served as a central brutal hub of the domestic slave trade, a city whose economic prosperity and social structure were inextricably linked to the buying and selling of human beings. Auction blocks and holding pens, the grim infrastructure of chattel slavery, were stark realities of daily life within its bustling streets. Now, on these very same thoroughfares, men in blue uniforms, many of whom shared their ancestry, their skin color, and their history of profound oppression, marched not as chattel, but as armed liberators. The initial shock of this unprecedented spectacle swiftly gave way to an explosive, unrestrained jubilation that surged through the alleys, tenements, and hidden corners of the city, where enslaved and free black communities had endured the long, brutal years of bondage. They poured into the streets, a surging, irrepressible tide of humanity, released from the suffocating dam of generations of servitude. Their shouts of joy, raw and piercing, mingled with cries of disbelief and overwhelming relief. Tears streamed freely down faces, some etched with the deep furrows of lifelong suffering, others smooth with the innocence of childhood. This was not a quiet, dignified reception. It was a spontaneous, cathartic explosion of emotion. Many ran alongside the marching columns, hands outstretched, eager to touch the coarse wool uniforms of the soldiers, to grasp a gloved hand, to make physical contact, as if seeking confirmation that this impossible dream, this miraculous intervention, was undeniably real. Their touch was an affirmation, a communion with the tangible embodiment of their freedom. Children, wide-eyed with wonder and unburdened by the historical weight of the moment, darted excitedly between the legs of adults, their laughter echoing through the solemn air. They mimicked the soldiers' march, their small, eager feet pattering against the cobblestones, fully immersed in the joyous effervescence that permeated the very fabric of the city. Elderly black women, their backs bent from decades of forced labor, their faces a testament to untold hardship, fell to their knees in the muddy streets. Their hands, gnarled and scarred, clasped together in spontaneous gestures of profound gratitude and deep reverence. Their silent prayers and whispered thanks carried the weight of generations of unfulfilled hope, now unexpectedly miraculously realized. One Union observer, profoundly moved by the scenes unfolding around him, recorded in his dispatches that the blacks seemed to have gone mad with joy, as if the Jubilee Day itself had come. Indeed, for this long-suffering population, it was precisely that, a day of long-awaited biblical proportions, a profound spiritual and physical emancipation from the brutal chains of an oppressive system. They spontaneously burst into spirituals of freedom, their voices soaring, improvising verses of liberation that mingled with heartfelt blessings offered to the soldiers who represented their deliverance. The joyous cacophony of their celebration filled the air, a stark and defiant counterpoint to the destructive roar of the previous night's fires. Meanwhile, behind the tightly drawn lace curtains and half-open shutters of their elegant red brick mansions, the white women of Richmond remained in a state of profound psychological paralysis. The raucous celebrations below, the unbridled joy of those they had always considered inherently inferior, was not merely offensive, it was a direct, irrefutable refutation of their entire worldview. Emma Mordecai, whose initial fascination with the USCT had been deeply tinged with horror, now found herself unable to process the jubilant scenes unfolding below her window. Her expressions, and those of her peers, glimpsed in neighboring windows or through parted drapes, were later described as a complex mixture of horror, fascination, and something akin to torpor. The horror stemmed from the sight of black agency and power, the fascination from the sheer incomprehensibility of it, and the torpor from the mental exhaustion of trying to reconcile this new reality with their deeply ingrained beliefs. The racial ideology that had structured every facet of their lives, from the labor in their opulent homes and vast fields, to the very economic and social fabric of their society, was not simply challenged, it had demonstrably violently failed. The black men, women, and children celebrating in the streets were not the docile, dependent figures their upbringing had taught them to expect. They were agents of a new, terrifying order, asserting their humanity and their freedom with an energy that felt, to the white observers, both menacing and utterly incomprehensible. Their gazes remained fixed, rigid, a testament to minds struggling desperately to reconcile an established, immutable reality with an undeniable, revolutionary truth that was unfolding before their eyes. The torpor was a defensive mechanism, a temporary shutdown of the mental faculties in the face of an existential threat to their most cherished, most foundational beliefs. The very pillars of their societal structure, built on the premise of black subservience and white supremacy, had crumbled into dust. The silence of the white mansions stood in stark, chilling contrast to the vibrant, jubilant chaos in the streets below. The profound symbolic weight of this transformation was further underscored the following day, April 4th, when President Abraham Lincoln himself embarked on an unexpected and almost clandestine visit to the fallen Confederate capital. Having traveled by boat up the James River, Lincoln, accompanied by his youngest son Tad and a small detachment of naval officers, disembarked and began to walk through the streets of Richmond. There was no grand procession, no fanfare. His presence was initially known only to a select few. Yet, as word of his arrival began to spread like wildfire, a throng of newly freed black citizens rapidly converged around him. This impromptu guard, initially composed of a mere 10 USCT soldiers, became the visual encapsulation of the war's radical outcome. Lincoln, tall and gaunt, his characteristic stovepipe hat perhaps less imposing in the face of the city's devastation, was besieged by crowds. They pressed close, many weeping openly, reaching out to touch his clothes, to grasp his hand, to confirm that the legendary figure, the great emancipator, was truly among them. Some, overwhelmed by emotion and reverence, fell to their knees in spontaneous acts of worship, seeing him as a messianic figure. Lincoln, a man whose own racial views had evolved significantly throughout the arduous conflict, found himself visibly uncomfortable with such adoration. He reportedly stated, with a gentle yet firm voice, "Do not kneel to me. That is not right. You must kneel only to God." His words, spoken amidst the jubilant chaos, served as a quiet reminder of the true source of their newfound freedom and the democratic principles he tirelessly sought to restore. His walk through Richmond, protected by armed black soldiers and surrounded by crowds of newly freed black people, solidified the profound symbolism of the Union victory. It was not merely a military triumph, but a moral one, inextricably linked to the abolition of slavery and the promise of black freedom. The scenes of exultation among the black population contrasted with the silent, rigid horror and bewildered torpor of the white residents, painted a vivid, unforgettable picture of a nation undergoing a wrenching, yet ultimately transformative rebirth. The emotional landscape of Richmond that day was a microcosm of the deeply divided American soul, grappling with the monumental consequences of a war that had redefined liberty itself, irrevocably altering the course of its history. The jubilant celebrations of Richmond's black population and the profound psychological shock of its white residents on April 3rd and 4th, 1865, represented a seismic shift in American history. Yet this revolutionary transformation, born in the crucible of war, was not without its profound complexities and deeply tragic limitations. The road to full equality, despite the triumphant march of the United States Colored Troops, USCT, into the former Confederate capital, would prove to be agonizingly long and fraught with setbacks. Even within the Union Army, the USCT soldiers, who had fought with undeniable courage and distinction, faced systemic discrimination. Their valor on battlefields from Port Hudson to Fort Wagner had proven their capabilities beyond doubt, yet they were not treated as equals. For much of the war, black soldiers received inferior pay, $10 per month, with $3 deducted for clothing, leaving them with only $7, while white soldiers earned $13 with no such deduction. This glaring disparity, a persistent affront to their dignity and sacrifice, was not rectified until Congress passed legislation in June 1864, granting them equal pay, retroactive to January 1864. This belated adjustment underscored the pervasive racial prejudices that permeated even the ranks of the Union forces. Beyond unequal pay, USCT units were disproportionately assigned to the most dangerous and arduous duties. They were often placed in the vanguard of perilous assaults, used in siege warfare where casualties were guaranteed to be high, or relegated to manual labor in disease-ridden areas such as malarial swamps. This strategic deployment contributed to a higher mortality rate among black soldiers. Approximately 20% of USCT troops perished during the war, compared to 15% for white Union forces, a grim testament to the hazardous conditions they faced. Furthermore, command structures largely remained segregated, with nearly all USCT regiments led by white officers, a testament to the lingering racial hierarchies. The threat of capture by Confederate forces presented an even graver peril. The Confederate government had officially declared that captured black Union soldiers would not be treated as legitimate prisoners of war. Instead, they faced the brutal prospect of execution, re-enslavement, or summary justice, often under the guise of being insurrectionists. White officers commanding black troops were also subject to execution. This policy instilled a desperate resolve in USCT units, who understood that surrender was often not an option, making their bravery under fire all the more remarkable. The Fort Pillow Massacre in April 1864, where Confederate forces under Nathan Bedford Forrest killed hundreds of black soldiers after they had surrendered, served as a chilling example of this horrific policy, casting a dark shadow over their service. The immediate aftermath of the war, known as the Reconstruction Era, 1865-1877, promised a radical, albeit fragile experiment in multiracial democracy in the South. African American men, newly enfranchised, actively participated in politics, holding elected office at local, state, and even federal levels. Educational institutions for freed people flourished, and the Freedmen's Bureau worked to establish former slaves as independent citizens. For a brief period, the vision of armed black men marching into Richmond seemed to foreshadow a truly egalitarian future. However, this hopeful revolutionary period was brutally and systematically rolled back in the decades that followed. The white South, humiliated by defeat and economically devastated, began a fierce campaign to reassert its traditional racial hierarchy. The withdrawal of federal troops from the South in 1877, as part of a political compromise, effectively ended Reconstruction, leaving newly freed black populations vulnerable. What followed was the pervasive rise of the Jim Crow laws, a complex and insidious system of state and local statutes designed to legalize racial segregation and ensure the economic and political subjugation of African Americans. These laws mandated separate facilities for black and white citizens in nearly every aspect of public life: schools, hospitals, transportation, and even cemeteries, effectively creating a caste system. Simultaneously, a systematic campaign of disenfranchisement was implemented, utilizing poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses to effectively strip black men of their hard-won right to vote, erasing their political voice. Adding a layer of terror to this legislative oppression was the rise of white supremacist paramilitary groups, most notably the Ku Klux Klan. Operating through intimidation, violence, and lynchings, the Klan sought to suppress black advancement and enforce racial subordination. Their tactics instilled fear, dismantled black economic progress, and curtailed political participation, further cementing the return to a system of de facto, if not de jure, slavery. Richmond itself, the city that had briefly witnessed the impossible vision of April 1865, became a powerful architectural and psychological battleground for memory. Decades after the war, in a deliberate act of historical revisionism and racial assertion, the city erected massive, imposing monuments to Confederate generals along its prestigious Monument Avenue. These towering statues of Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, and others served as a potent, defiant response to the humiliation of occupation, a symbolic reclaiming of a lost narrative that glorified the lost cause and implicitly reasserted white supremacy. They stood as stone declarations intended to eclipse the memory of black Union soldiers marching through their city, an attempt to write out of history the very event that had redefined American freedom. Yet, despite the painful reversals, the systemic oppression, and the deliberate rewriting of history, something utterly irrevocable had changed on that smoke-laden dawn of April 3, 1865. The women of Richmond, watching from their windows, who found it impossible to turn away from the sight of armed black men, were witnessing what the historian W.E.B. Du Bois would later term abolition democracy. This was the moment when the war, initially fought for the preservation of the Union, had definitively transformed into a war for black freedom and the fundamental redefinition of American citizenship. Those soldiers, marching with an unparalleled dignity and purpose, many of whom would not survive more than a few decades in the precarious freedom of the post-war South, represented the most radical possibility the American nation had ever contemplated. They symbolized the potential for democracy to truly include those who had previously been excluded from the very category of human. Their rhythmic boots on the cobblestones of Broad Street echoed not merely a military victory, but a profound, though contentious and painful, beginning to a new, redefined era in American history, an era where the fight for true equality had only just begun. The vision they presented, however inconvenient or terrifying for some, could never be fully erased, a testament to a shift that, even in its thwarted promise, had forever altered the nation's course. The march of the United States colored troops into Richmond on April 3, 1865, irrevocably splintered the very fabric of a city and a nation. It was a climax where the echoes of destruction met the drumbeat of liberation. For the formerly enslaved, it ignited an explosive, unbridled jubilation, a tangible confirmation of a long-dreamed freedom. For the white residents, it delivered a profound psychological shock, witnessing the collapse of an entire social and racial order. President Lincoln's subsequent walk through the fallen Capitol, guarded by black soldiers and surrounded by the newly freed, solidified this transformation, embedding a new, undeniable truth into the scarred landscape of the Confederacy. This pivotal moment, however, was not an endpoint but a contentious beginning. As history reveals, the path from such a monumental shift to enduring equality is rarely linear. The shadows of discrimination persisted, and the fragile gains of Reconstruction would later be brutally challenged by resurgent systems of oppression. Yet the vision witnessed that April dawn, armed black men marching as conquerors into the heart of the slaveholding South, represented the profound dawn of what W.E.B. Du Bois termed abolition democracy. It was a radical possibility, a testament to dignity reclaimed, and an unerasable blueprint for a nation perpetually striving toward its ideals, however imperfect its journey. The stark contrast of human experience in Richmond that day forces us to reflect on how such powerful visual events challenge and redefine societal beliefs. What does this singular moment reveal about the enduring struggle for justice and recognition? We invite your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. If this deep dive into a transformative moment resonated with you, consider exploring another chapter from the hidden archives of history. Discover more untold stories right here on Hidden Files. And if you value uncovering these crucial narratives, please support our work by liking this video and subscribing to the Hidden Files channel.